A brass scale trembled under the weight of gold dust, while a folded paper lay beside it, describing a woman's debt in dollars and never once asking her name. Su Lin Ong stood with her hands folded over a small cloth bundle at the edge of a crowded dockside street, watching two men argue over the price of her contract as though she were a mule too thin to be worth the trouble of haggling. What neither of them understood, and what she had learned to keep behind a still and patient face, was that she could read every clause of that paper faster than either of them could speak it aloud. Mr. Pruitt counted the coin twice before he was satisfied, the way a man counts money he has not truly earned, and told the gathered miners that the camp now had a cook and a laundress both, delivered off the wagon with her debt still owing. Past the sluice boxes on Widow Creek, a solitary miner named Caleb Winslow paused his shovel long enough to watch the transaction and did not like the shape of it, though 3 years of working a claim alone had taught him better than to say so to a crowd of strangers. 3 ridges away, in an office lined with scale weights and crucibles, the county assayer Thaddeus Corwin dipped his pen and wrote 2 different numbers on 2 different pages, one for the ledger he kept for himself, and one for the report he intended the world to read. He did not yet know that a woman he considered incapable of reading his own language would spend the coming weeks doing his laundry, sweeping his floor, and memorizing every figure his careless hand left open on the desk. When Caleb Winslow finally stepped into the argument over her contract, he did not ask what she could scrub or how fast she could learn English. He asked her name, plainly, the way a man asks a neighbor rather than appraises a possession. And something in Su Lin's chest loosened for the first time since the ship's deck had disappeared behind her. Neither of them yet knew that her name would one day be read aloud in a county courthouse, over a fraud that would try to erase everything Obadiah Sackett left her. Su Lin Ong had been 3 months crossing an ocean and a continent by the time the stagecoach rattled into Gold Run, and she arrived at the mining camp already fluent in a kind of arithmetic. No schoolbook back in Toishan had prepared her for how much a debt could grow between a promise made in her father's shop and a paper signed in a broker's office in San Francisco. Her uncle had arranged the contract with the confidence of a man closing a good trade, describing a respectable marriage to a Gold Mountain merchant who would send money home twice a year. The merchant did not exist. What existed instead was Mr. Silas Pruitt, a labor broker with ink-stained cuffs and an easy smile, who met her at the wharf holding a paper that named a debt 3 times what her passage had cost, and called it, without apparent irony, an act of Christian charity. She had read the paper twice before signing it. Once aloud for the broker's benefit, haltingly in the plain and careful English her father had drilled into her over a merchant's ledger since she was 7 years old, and once silently in the seconds before she signed, absorbing every clause the way her father had taught her to absorb a contract before trusting it. Pruitt had not noticed the second reading. Men rarely noticed the second reading, she had already learned, because they assumed a woman's silence meant comprehension had never occurred at all. The wagon ride up into the Sierra took 4 days, climbing switchbacks cut through granite and pine until the air itself turned thin and sharp with resin. And by the time Gold Run came into view, a scatter of canvas tents and raw plank buildings strung along a creek the color of weak tea. Su Lin had memorized every landmark, every fork in the road, the way her mother had once taught her to memorize the location of a healing herb she might need again in darkness. The camp smelled of wood smoke, mule sweat, and the mineral tang of turned earth, and the men who turned to watch the wagon arrive did so with the frank, cataloging stares of buyers at a livestock pen. Pruitt handed her down from the wagon by the wrist rather than the hand, presented her contract to the camp's assembled bachelors as though unveiling a prize mule, and announced to general approval that Gold Run finally had a cook and a laundress who would work off her passage debt at a fair and Christian rate. Su Lin kept her eyes on the creek rather than the men, watching the water break white over granite stones, and reminded herself of the promise she had made her younger brother the night before she left Toishan, that she would return for him, however long the debt took to clear, because a Gamsan fortune existed for those patient enough to outlast the men who tried to keep it from them. The tent Pruitt assigned her stood at the camp's ragged edge, nearest the laundry troughs and farthest from anything resembling privacy, and its canvas walls did nothing to muffle the camp's nightly arguments over cards, water rights, and the price of flour at the company store. Her first evening, she met the elder laundryman everyone at Gold Run called Old Quan, His given name was Quan Wing Tak, though the camp had never once troubled to learn it, who had worked the camps of the Sierra for nearly 20 years and had learned, in that time, to read a newcomer's fate in the particular way she held her shoulders. He spoke to her in the dialect of a province 200 miles from her own, close enough that they understood each other in halves and gestures, and he told her plainly, without unkindness, what she could expect, that Pruitt's debts had a way of growing rather than shrinking, that the camp's patience with a woman's presence lasted exactly as long as her usefulness, and that the wisest survival lay in being useful in ways no one thought to resent. She spent that first night sorting the camp's laundry by lantern light, cataloging the men of gold, run by the state of their shirts the way her mother had once cataloged patients by the color of their tongues, and found herself already forming a private ledger of who among them might be reasoned with and who was better avoided entirely. Pruitt appeared at her tent flap near midnight, not to threaten her, only to remind her, almost cheerfully, that her contract remained unpaid and that a man from the Pacific Ridge Company office had asked that very afternoon whether Gold Run's newest arrival might be available for laundry work up at the county seat as well, an arrangement that would extend her debt rather than shorten it. She said nothing in reply beyond a soft, practiced "Magoi," thank you, the two syllables doing the work of agreement without costing her anything true, and Pruitt left satisfied that he had been understood exactly as much as he wished to be. Alone again, she unwrapped the small bundle she had carried across an ocean, a strip of silk, her mother's herb pouch, and her father's abacus, its dark wooden frame worn smooth by 3 generations of counting hands. One bead on the topmost rod, carved from a single chip of pale jade. She ran her thumb across that jade bead in the dark, the way she had every night since Toyshan, and wondered, not for the first time, whether her silo, her little brother, was old enough yet to understand why she had left, or whether he still believed, as she had once let herself believe, that Gold Mountain kept its promises to everyone who crossed an ocean to reach it. By her second week at Gold Run, Sulin had learned the precise geometry of the camp's cookhouse well enough to move through it blind, the iron stove that scorched everything on its left side, the flour barrel that drew mice, the exact board in the floor that groaned under a heavy boot and announced a man's arrival before he spoke. She had not, however, learned any way to become invisible while serving supper to men who discussed her future as though the plank counter between them were soundproof. Sheriff Amos Teague, a heavy-set man who wore his badge the way other men wore an excuse, leaned against the cookhouse doorframe one evening and asked Pruitt, in the unhurried tone of a man discussing weather, whether the celestial girl understood a word of English or whether her nodding was simply good manners. Pruitt allowed that he doubted it, given that she'd arrived speaking nothing but her own tongue and a few learned phrases, and the two men continued discussing her prospects, whether the company store might extend her credit, whether Pacific Ridge's man in the county seat still wanted laundry sent up on Thursdays, whether it was true what the last camp said about celestial women and their strange remedies, with the easy carelessness of men reviewing livestock at auction. Sulin ladled stew into tin plates and kept her face arranged in the placid blankness she had practiced since the ship's hold, while behind that blankness she catalogued every word, every insinuation, every plan being made for her future, without once consulting her about it. Her father had been a ledger clerk for a rice merchant in Canton for 30 years, respected enough that officials brought him their private accounts to check when their own clerks made errors, and he had taught her, overnights bent together above his account books, that a person who could read numbers and words others assumed closed to her held a particular kind of power, quiet and dangerous and entirely her own. She had not expected to need that power quite this soon, quite this literally, standing over a stew pot while a sheriff and a labor broker priced her patience in Thursdays. When Teague finally turned to leave, he paused at the door and remarked, almost as an afterthought, that the assayer up at the county seat, a Mr. Corwin, kept a tidy office and might appreciate a woman who could clean it properly since his last housekeeper had quit over the smell of the crucibles. Sulin filed the name away in the same private ledger where she kept everything else worth remembering, not yet understanding how much that single careless remark would come to matter. Word of the sheriff's suggestion reached Pruitt's ledger within the week, and by the second Thursday of her third month at Gold Run, Su Lin found herself making the 4-mile walk to the county seat each Thursday morning, a basket of Corwin's linens balanced against her hip, her debt to Pruitt extended rather than reduced by the arrangement, exactly as old Quan had warned her it would be. Corwin's office sat apart from the rest of the county buildings, a squat structure of milled lumber with a brass scale bolted to the counter, and a wall of pigeonholed shelving crowded with sample bags, each one labeled in a cramped, hurried hand. She found, on her first cleaning, unexpectedly easy to read. She did not linger over the labels that first visit, mindful of old Quan's warning about being useful in ways no one thought to resent. But she noticed, the way her father had trained her to notice a column of figures that didn't sum correctly, that Corwin kept 2 distinct sets of papers on his desk, one bound in worn leather and clearly meant for his own eyes, the other loose and formal, evidently intended for the county recorder's files. She thought nothing more of it that first Thursday, occupied instead with scrubbing ore dust from cuffs and folding linens with the same careful attention her mother had once brought to folding medicinal herbs for storage. But she overheard, while sweeping the front step, 2 men in dark city coats speaking to Corwin through the half-open window about a company called Pacific Ridge Consolidated and its interest in clearing the whole gulch of small claims before the spring thaw, their voices carrying the particular confidence of men who assumed no one nearby understood enough English to matter. Su Lin swept the same 3 feet of step for a full extra minute, memorizing the shape of a name she had never heard before. Yarnell, the taller man called himself, representing interests the county would do well not to obstruct, and felt, for the first time since Gold Run's dust had settled around her, the cold and specific fear of understanding a danger before anyone thought to warn her of it. That night, she pressed her thumb to the jade bead on her father's abacus and whispered a phrase he had taught her long before she understood why a merchant's daughter might need it. Humeng, good fortune, is a debt collected slowly, one true number at a time. The trouble started at the company's store on a Saturday crowded with miners settling their accounts before the weekend, when a red-faced prospector named Gus Harmon decided that a laundry girl who could not properly count his change back to him in English deserved to forfeit the difference entirely. Su Lin had counted the coins correctly. She counted every transaction correctly, a habit worn into her by a childhood spent checking her father's arithmetic for pleasure rather than obligation. But Harmon's voice rose loud enough to draw a small crowd, and crowds she had learned since the docks of San Francisco rarely sided with the quiet party in a dispute. It was Caleb Winslow, 3 weeks off his own claim and smelling of creek water and granite dust, who set down the sack of flour he'd been carrying and asked, in a voice pitched only slightly above conversation, whether Harmon intended to rob a woman of 2 bits in front of half the camp, or whether he'd simply lost the ability to count his own money. The crowd's mood shifted the way weather shifts on the ridge, sudden and total, and Harmon, recalculating the odds of the argument, muttered something about foreign witchery and retreated toward the bar with what dignity he could gather. Caleb did not acknowledge the small murmur of approval that followed him, nor did he linger to be thanked. Instead, he turned to Su Lin directly, meeting her eyes the way almost no man at Gold Run bothered to do, and asked her a question no one had asked her since the docks of San Francisco. Not what she could scrub, not how quickly she'd learn proper English, not what her debt amounted to. Simply her name, spoken plainly, as though the answer mattered to him and not merely to a ledger. She told him, haltingly, correcting the shape of the vowels twice before he nodded that he'd heard it right, and something in his weathered, sun-cracked face suggested he intended to remember it, rather than forget it by supper. He paid Harmon's full outstanding tab himself before he left, not as charity toward her, but, he said, because a man ought to settle his own debts honestly or not shop where honest people worked, and the distinction, small as it seemed, told Su Lin more about him than a month of camp gossip could have managed. Old Quan, watching from the store's shaded porch, remarked afterward that the miner up on Widow Creek had a reputation for keeping to himself and settling his own troubles quietly, and that Su Lin would do well to notice that a man who defended a stranger's arithmetic in public rarely did so without meaning it. In the weeks that followed, Caleb's visits to the camp store fell. By no coincidence, Su Lin eventually recognized, on the same Thursday mornings, she carried Corwin's laundry down from the county seat, and their exchanges lengthened by degrees the way a creek widens as it drops from the high country. A comment about the weather, a question about whether the herbs she gathered along the trail were for cooking or for medicine. An offer, gruffly made, to carry her basket the steeper half-mile without being asked twice. He spoke to her plainly, the way he'd spoken to Harmon, without the exaggerated slowness or raised volume other campmen used when addressing her, as though loudness might somehow bridge a gap that had nothing to do with hearing. She learned, in pieces he never volunteered directly, that he had staked his own claim on Widow Creek 3 years earlier after a mining accident on the railroad grade had taken his younger brother, and that he worked it alone now, not from choice, but because grief had made him poor company for partnership. She did not tell him, in those early weeks, that she understood every word he said the first time he said it, nor that she had been reading English fluently since she was old enough to hold a brush, preferring instead to let her spoken English arrive slowly, in careful fragments, because a woman whose comprehension was underestimated collected information other people forgot to guard. It was old Quan who brought the first troubling news, arriving at her tent one evening, with his face arranged in the particular stillness of a man delivering bad news gently. Obadiah Sackett, an elderly miner working a modest claim a mile upstream along Widow Creek, had taken to his bunk 3 days prior with a fever the camp doctor could neither name nor cool, and the men nursing him in shifts had begun, in the resigned way of frontier camps, accustomed to loss, discussing which of his few possessions might go towards settling his outstanding debts once he was gone. Su Lin listened to the description of Sackett's symptoms, the fever's particular rhythm, the delirium arriving each evening and lifting each dawn, the rash old Quan had glimpsed along his forearms, and felt a cold and specific recognition settle over her, the same recognition she had once felt watching her mother diagnose a neighbor's child from across a crowded room, because she had seen this fever before in her mother's sick room in Toishan, and she knew, with a certainty that frightened her, that the camp doctor was treating entirely the wrong illness. The camp doctor, a former Army surgeon named Willard Hobbs who treated most ailments at Gold Run with whiskey, bleeding, or a combination of both, had already told the men keeping vigil over Obadiah Sackett that the old miner's fever would break within the week, or it would not break at all, and that further intervention beyond keeping him comfortable was, in his professional opinion, wasted effort. Su Lin stood at the edge of Sackett's tent that evening, uninvited and uncertain of her welcome, watching the old man toss beneath a damp blanket while his skin burned dry and his breath rattled in a pattern she recognized with a certainty that made her chest tight. Her mother had treated this fever a dozen times in Toishan, back when it swept through the rice villages each autumn on the tail of the flood season, and she had learned, standing at her mother's elbow since she was old enough to grind herbs without spilling them, that the illness responded not to bleeding, but to cooling the blood from within. Using bark and root, her mother had gathered along specific stream banks for exactly this purpose. She had recognized, on her Thursday walks to the county seat, a stand of willow along Widow Creek, whose bark carried the same bitter, cooling properties as the tree her mother favored, growing wild and unremarked a half-mile from Sackett's tent. Caleb found her there at the willow stand near midnight, stripping bark by lantern light with a focus that startled him. And when she explained, in her careful, halting English, what she intended and why, he did not laugh or question her competence the way she had braced herself to expect. He simply asked what else she needed and set about gathering it, and within the hour they had returned to Sackett's tent together, where Su Lin brewed a bitter decoction over a low fire, while the men keeping vigil watched with open suspicion, several of them muttering that foreign remedies belonged in foreign countries, and that Doc Hobbs's methods, however limited, were at least familiar. Old Quan, arriving to translate her intentions for men who assumed she needed translating, found instead that Caleb had already positioned himself between her and the most vocal doubters, arms crossed, saying nothing beyond the simple fact that she'd earned the right to try. Su Lin knelt beside Sackett's bunk as the old man's fever peaked toward its dangerous midnight hour, spooned the bitter medicine between his cracked lips a mouthful at a time, and pressed cool cloths to his wrists the way her mother had taught her, murmuring to him in a low, steady voice. Not because he could understand her words, but because her mother had always said that a dying man's ear was the last part of him to give up hope. Sackett's fever broke 2 hours before dawn, so suddenly and completely that Doc Hobbs, summoned back to confirm it, examined the old man twice before admitting, with the particular grudging honesty of a man whose professional pride had just taken a public wound, that he could not explain the recovery by any method he'd been trained to trust. The camp's reaction split cleanly along lines Sulin had learned to expect. Some men credited luck, others credited Hobbs after all, and a handful, including Gus Harmon, muttered darkly about foreign witchery in terms that made Caleb's jaw tighten, though he said nothing in front of Sackett's sickbed. Sackett himself, weak but lucid for the first time in 4 days, asked to see the woman who had nursed him, and when Sulin appeared at his tent flap the following afternoon, he studied her for a long moment with the sharp, assessing eyes of a man who had spent 40 years reading the ground for gold and had learned in the process to read people just as carefully. He did not thank her the way campmen thanked each other, with a slap on the back and a round of drinks. Instead, he asked her, plainly and without preamble, what her mother had taught her besides fever cures, and listened, genuinely listened, while she described in her careful accumulating English the herbs and remedies and small arithmetic of dosages her mother had passed down across a kitchen table in Toyshan. Word of the recovery reached Pruitt within the day, and his reaction, when he found Sulin at the wash troughs that evening, was neither gratitude nor concern for Sackett's health, but a swift and practical recalculation of her value, remarking that a woman with genuine healing skill might fetch considerably more in laundry contracts across 3 camps than she currently earned in 1, and that he intended to discuss the matter with the Pacific Ridge office representative on his next visit. Sulin said nothing beyond her usual soft agreement, filing the thread away in the same private ledger where she kept Yarnell's name and Corwin's 2 sets of papers. And that night, alone in her tent, she unwrapped her mother's herb pouch and pressed it to her face, breathing in the faint dried scent of home, and allowed herself, for exactly as long as it took the camp's lanterns to burn down, to miss her mother with a rawness she rarely permitted herself in daylight, whispering into the dark a phrase her mother used to end every remedy: "Ping on, be at peace," though peace remained, for now, a debt as unpaid as any other she carried. Obadiah Sackett lived another 6 weeks past his fever, long enough to see the aspens along Widow Creek turn gold and drop, but the illness that finally claimed him arrived slower and more certain than the one Sulin had cured. A tightness in his chest that Doc Hobbs correctly identified this time as consumption, advanced too far for any remedy her mother had ever taught her. Sackett received the diagnosis with the same flat practicality he brought to reading a claim's prospects, and spent his remaining strength not in denial, but in settling his affairs with the brisk efficiency of a man who had outlived every relation he'd ever had, and intended to leave his accounts in order regardless. He had worked the Copper Bend claim on Widow Creek for 11 years, a modest but steadily producing stretch of ground that had kept him fed and independent long after most of his contemporaries had either struck it rich elsewhere or given up the mountains entirely, and he had no wife, no children, and no surviving family closer than a cousin in Ohio he hadn't corresponded with in 2 decades. On a clear afternoon in late October, he summoned Sulin to his tent, along with Old Quan and Caleb, and informed them, without ceremony, that he intended to will the Copper Bend claim to the woman who had bought him 6 extra weeks of aspen gold and clear mountain air when a licensed doctor had already written him off. Sulin protested, genuinely startled, that she had done nothing more than what her mother had taught her, that a debt of kindness required no such enormous repayment. But Sackett cut her off with the particular sternness of a dying man uninterested in false modesty. He told her, in words she would carry for the rest of her life, that he had watched this camp treat her like furniture with ears since the day Pruitt drove her down Gold Run's main street, had watched her earn every scrap of respect she'd gathered through sheer competence while men half her worth inherited theirs by birthright, and that he'd be damned, his words exactly, if his claim went to some distant cousin who'd never so much as visited these mountains, rather than to the one person in 3 counties who'd actually looked after him when it mattered. Old Quan, summoned specifically as a witness who could attest, if ever the will's legitimacy were questioned, that Sackett had made the decision freely and in full possession of his faculties, watched the old miner dictate the document's terms to a traveling notary with tears he made no effort to hide, and Caleb stood silent at the tense entrance throughout, his expression unreadable to everyone present except, perhaps, to Su Lin, who had learned by then to read the particular stillness he wore when something moved him too deeply for words. Sackett died 11 days later, quietly in his sleep, with Su Lin and Old Quan both present at his bedside, and the camp buried him on the ridge above his own claim with more genuine mourning than Gold Run typically spared for men who died owing nobody anything. The will itself, properly notarized and witnessed, went to the county recorder's office within the week, where a young clerk named Whitfield explained to Su Lin, with more patience than most county officials extended to her, that California statute required any claim changing hands outside a direct sale to undergo a formal assay before the transfer could be permanently recorded. A routine safeguard, he assured her, meant mainly to prevent fraudulent claims of ownership, rather than to judge the ground's actual worth. Su Lin thanked him in her careful English and left the recorder's office with a distinct, uncomfortable sense that a routine safeguard, in a county where Pacific Ridge Consolidated Mining Company maintained an office 2 doors down from the recorder himself, might prove rather less routine than young Mr. Whitfield believed. Her instinct sharpened considerably 3 days later when she arrived at Corwin's office for her regular Thursday cleaning and overheard, through the same half-open window where she'd first heard Yarnell's name, the Assayer himself discussing the Sackett will with a man she recognized as one of Yarnell's associates, their voices low but not quite low enough. Corwin remarked that the Copper Bend claim sat directly athwart the water rights Pacific Ridge needed to consolidate its hydraulic operation along Widow Creek, and that a claim recently inherited by a foreign woman with no standing in this county would present considerably less legal difficulty to acquire than one held by an established miner with friends in the county seat. The associate laughed and asked whether Corwin anticipated any trouble certifying the assay, however the office required it to read, and Corwin's reply, delivered with the easy confidence of a man who had done this before and been paid well for it, was that the ground would read whatever value the county recorder's file needed it to read, and that his professional reputation had survived considerably more scrutiny than one woman's claim was likely to invite. Su Lin swept the same 3 feet of step for a full minute afterward, exactly as she had the first time she'd overheard Yarnell's plans, and understood, with a clarity that settled cold and certain in her stomach, that Sackett's dying gift had just become the most dangerous possession she had ever held, and that Gam-san, the golden mountain her father had once described in letters home with such uncomplicated hope, was about to show her its truest and least golden face. Corwin arrived at Copper Bend 8 days later to conduct the assay himself, a formality he performed with theatrical thoroughness for the benefit of Caleb and Old Quan, who stood as witnesses to the sampling process at Su Lin's request, chipping ore from 3 separate points along the exposed quartz vein Sackett had worked for over a decade, and sealing each sample in a labeled canvas bag with evident professional care. He made polite, unhurried conversation throughout, remarking on the pleasant autumn weather and the quality of Sackett's timber cribbing, and gave no outward sign whatsoever of the conversation Su Lin had overheard through his office window 11 days prior, which unsettled her considerably more than open hostility would have, because a man who could lie this comfortably to her face was a man whose written reports she would never be able to trust on reputation alone. She returned to her Thursday cleaning at his office the following week with a purpose she had not carried into that building before, no longer simply sweeping and folding, but watching, with the same disciplined attention her father had trained into her over his rice merchant ledgers, exactly where Corwin kept his working notes as he processed the Copper Bend samples in the small back room fitted with his crucibles and scale. She found her opportunity on a Thursday when Corwin left abruptly for the county seat's telegraph office, called away by a wire from the Pacific Ridge Company's regional agent, and left his private leather-bound ledger open on the desk beside the crucible he'd used that same morning. Su Lin did not touch the ledger, mindful that a moved object might be noticed and a missing page might be missed, but she stood over it for the length of time it took to dust the shelf above his desk, reading the entry for Copper Bend twice to fix every figure precisely in her memory, an assay value nearly 4 times what a modest working claim typically returned, annotated in Corwin's own hand with the phrase, "Vein continues, strong probability of depth," followed by a second notation, added evidently after some private calculation of his own, estimating the claim's worth to a buyer prepared to develop it properly at a sum that made her breath catch in her throat. She dusted the shelf a second time, memorizing the figures the way her father had once taught her to memorize a column of numbers before checking her arithmetic against the original, using the same silent mental counting frame she pictured whenever she needed to hold a long series of figures steady in her mind, an invisible version of the very abacus wrapped in silk inside her own tent. 3 weeks passed before Corwin's official report reached the county recorder's file. 3 weeks during which Su Lin continued her Thursday visits with an outward calm that cost her considerably more effort than it once had, aware now that every folded shirt and swept floor brought her closer to a confrontation she could not yet see the shape of clearly. She came close to discovery only once, on a raw November afternoon, when Corwin returned from the telegraph office earlier than expected and found her standing nearer his desk than her cleaning duties strictly required. And though she covered the moment by lifting a stack of papers as though tidying them, she saw, in the brief narrowing of his eyes before his professional smile reasserted itself, that he had at least considered the possibility that she understood more of what crossed his desk than he had ever troubled to imagine. He said nothing directly, only remarked, with a thin edge beneath the pleasantry, that his files required a particular order and that she needn't trouble herself rearranging anything beyond the dust. And Su Lin apologized in her careful English and did not return her attention to his desk again that afternoon. Though she had already committed the figures she needed to a memory, she trusted considerably more than her voice. The official report, when it finally arrived at the recorder's office, declared the copper bend claims ore samples of low grade and inconsistent distribution, concluding, in Corwin's formal and unhurried prose, that the ground showed insufficient promise to justify the expense of continued development, and recommending, in a final paragraph that made young clerk Whitfield visibly uncomfortable as he read it aloud to her, that the claim be considered for reassignment under the county's abandoned ground provisions should its current holder fail to demonstrate active, profitable work within 90 days. Su Lin listened to the entire report without a single change in her expression, the same placid stillness she had perfected serving stew to men who discussed her future over her head, and thanked Mr. Whitfield politely for reading it to her before walking out into the cold November afternoon and standing alone beside the recorder's hitching post for a long, silent moment. She thought of her father, bent over his rice merchant's ledgers late into the night, telling her once that a false number was rarely a clever lie but simply a lazy one, easy to write and easier to catch if a person troubled to check the arithmetic behind it. And she thought, with a coldness that steadied rather than frightened her, of the true figures still sitting perfectly preserved in her memory, waiting for the moment someone in this county would finally ask her directly what she actually knew. News of the worthless declaration traveled through Gold Run faster than any assay results Su Lin had ever seen the camp discuss, carried mouth to mouth with the particular relish frontier settlements reserved for a story that let everyone feel they had suspected the outcome all along. Mrs. Dill, who ran the company store's dry goods counter with her husband and had never previously troubled to address Su Lin by more than a curt nod, refused outright the following week to extend her the small credit she'd routinely allowed for flour and coffee, remarking to another customer in a voice pitched deliberately to Carrie that folks ought to have known better than to trust a claim handed over so conveniently by a dying old man who'd clearly lost his wits at the end. Sheriff Teague made his own position clear a few days later, appearing at Su Lin's tent with the county's 90-day abandonment notice in hand, and reading it to her slowly and loudly, as though volume might compensate for whatever he assumed her English lacked, informing her that unless she could demonstrate active, profitable development of the Copper Bend ground within the stated window, the claim would revert to the county for reassignment, a process he noted, with a thin smile that made his meaning perfectly clear, that Pacific Ridge Consolidated had already expressed considerable interest in expediting. Su Lin took the notice from his hand, read it herself in full view of him, rather than waiting for a translation she plainly did not require, and watched with quiet satisfaction as the sheriff's smile faltered at the realization that his volume had been entirely wasted on a woman who had understood every word of the county code before he'd finished the first sentence. She said nothing beyond thanking him for the notice, unwilling to reveal her hand before she understood the full shape of the game being played against her, but The encounter left her badly shaken once he'd gone, aware now that the camp's suspicion had hardened into something closer to consensus, and that the 90 days ticking down against her were being counted by men who had every reason to want her to fail before she ever reached the county courthouse steps. Old Quan brought her what comfort he could that evening, reminding her that camps had turned on outsiders before and turned back again just as quickly once the truth surfaced. But even his steady optimism carried an undertone of worry he did not entirely manage to hide, because he too understood that a company willing to falsify an assay would not hesitate to falsify considerably more if it meant clearing Widow Creek of every obstacle standing between Pacific Ridge and its water rights. Caleb's decision to stand publicly with her came not as a single dramatic gesture, but as a series of small, deliberate choices made in full view of a camp already primed to judge him for making them, beginning with his insistence, voiced plainly at the company store counter where Mrs. Dill had refused Su Lin credit, that he would personally guarantee any debt she incurred there, and expected the guarantee honored the same as any man's. Mrs. Dill honored it, grudgingly, but the exchange cost Caleb something with the camp's opinion of him that he had never much cared about before, and found, to his own mild surprise, that he cared about now only insofar as it might complicate matters for Su Lin rather than himself. Yarnell's associate paid Caleb a visit at his own claim the following week, arriving with the studied friendliness of a man who preferred negotiation to confrontation, and suggested, in terms polite enough to avoid outright threat while leaving no real doubt of his meaning, that a solitary miner who involved himself in a neighboring claim's legal troubles might find his own water rights along Widow Creek unexpectedly complicated, come the spring diversion permits. Caleb heard the man out without interruption, in the same unhurried manner Su Lin had watched him use to face down Gus Harmon at the company store months before, and told him, when he'd finished, that he'd worked this creek for 3 years without needing Pacific Ridge's permission to do so, and didn't intend to start needing it now. Over a piece of paper, an honest man had a right to leave to whoever he chose. The visitor left without further pleasantries, and Caleb rode straight to Su Lin's tent afterward to tell her plainly what had transpired, refusing when she urged him to distance himself from her legal troubles before they cost him his own claim, to entertain the suggestion for even a moment. She studied his face in the lantern light that evening, searching, as she had 100 times since Sackett's death, for the particular self-interest she had learned to expect beneath every man's kindness, and found instead only the same plain, unhurried steadiness that had first made her trust him at the company store counter, unchanged by 90 days of mounting pressure, or by a company willing to threaten a man's livelihood for the crime of decency. That night, alone again after he'd gone, she took out her father's abacus and turned the jade bead slowly beneath her thumb, remembering a phrase he had murmured over difficult accounts late into the night, when a column of figures refused to balance no matter how many times he checked it. Machen lie, slowly, patiently, comes. The truth arrives on its own schedule, and a wise accountant learns to outlast it rather than force it. The idea to search the recorder's public files for a pattern in Corwin's prior assessments came to Su Lin not as a sudden inspiration, but as the natural next step in an arithmetic problem she had been quietly solving since the afternoon she'd first read his private ledger, because her father had taught her that a single suspicious figure proved very little on its own, while a pattern of suspicious figures proved almost everything. She enlisted young clerk Whitfield's help without revealing her full purpose, asking only, with the polite persistence that had gradually earned her a measure of the clerk's genuine respect over her many visits regarding the Sackett will, whether county records of past claim assessments were available for a citizen's inspection, and Whitfield, perhaps sensing more than he said aloud, produced the relevant ledgers without further question. Over 3 successive visits, spread across 2 weeks to avoid drawing notice, Su Lin worked through 11 years of Corwin's filed assay reports with Caleb beside her cross-checking dates against the county's separate register of claims subsequently purchased by Pacific Ridge Consolidated. And the pattern that emerged confirmed what she had suspected, since overhearing Yarnell's associate laugh through Corwin's office window. 6 claims along Widow Creek and its tributaries, all declared worthless or marginal by Corwin's official assessments over the preceding 4 years, had each been acquired by Pacific Ridge within 18 months of their condemnation, typically for a fraction of their original claimant's asking price. And in every case, the sellers had been men without family connections in the county, without the resources to challenge an official finding, or, in 2 instances, Su Lin noted with a particular cold anger, recent widows managing claims left to them by deceased husbands. Old Quan, examining the pattern laid out across Su Lin's careful handwritten notes one evening, remarked quietly that he had heard rumors along these lines for years without anyone troubling to prove them, because proving them required exactly the kind of patient, methodical literacy that the camps had never imagined a woman like her possessing. Caleb, studying the same notes, asked the question that mattered most: whether the pattern alone would satisfy a county mining commissioner, or whether they needed something more direct, something that connected Corwin's false report to his own private figures beyond a woman's memory of numbers she'd read once through a window of dust motes and afternoon light. Su Lin considered the question carefully before answering, turning the jade bead of her father's abacus between her fingers the way she always did when working through a difficult sum, and told him that memory alone might not satisfy a skeptical commissioner, but a man's own duplicate ledger, produced in evidence beside his official filing, would leave very little room for anyone to argue the discrepancy away as a washerwoman's mistaken recollection. Securing the actual ledger proved harder than identifying its existence, since Corwin had grown noticeably more careful about leaving his private papers exposed after the afternoon Su Lin had lingered too near his desk, locking the leather-bound volume in a drawer each evening before he left the office and carrying the key, as far as she could determine, through several more weeks of careful observation, on his own person at all times. The breakthrough came not through any scheme of Su Lin's devising, but through young Whitfield himself, who approached Caleb quietly one afternoon at the recorder's office to report that Corwin, several months prior, had been legally required to file a routine copy of his working notes with the county's Mineral Survey Office in Sacramento, a bureaucratic formality most assayers treated as an afterthought and few ever imagined anyone would trouble to retrieve. Whitfield, it turned out, had grown genuinely troubled by the patterns Su Lin's research had revealed and offered, at real risk to his own position should Corwin or Pacific Ridge learn of his assistance, to file the formal request for those Sacramento records himself, using his official capacity to expedite what might otherwise take a private citizen many months to obtain. Su Lin thanked him with a formality that failed to fully convey how deeply his quiet courage moved her, understanding better than most in the county exactly what it cost a young man, with a career still ahead of him, to stand against the wishes of a company as powerful as Pacific Ridge Consolidated. The Sacramento records arrived by mail 11 days later, and Whitfield delivered them to Su Lin's tent under cover of darkness, rather than risk being seen carrying county mail to a claim holder the camp still gossiped about. And the copied working notes matched, figure for figure, the private ledger entries Su Lin had committed to memory months before, providing exactly the documentary proof Caleb had said they would need. That same week, however, the intimidation Su Lin had feared finally arrived in tangible form. Someone crept along Widow Creek in the small hours and diverted the sluice gate feeding water to the Copper Bend claim's small working operation. A piece of sabotage subtle enough to claim as accident, but pointed enough, arriving precisely as their evidence gathering reached its critical stage, that neither Su Lin nor Caleb mistook it for coincidence. Caleb repaired the gate before dawn and said little about it afterward beyond a grim promise to keep closer watch on the creek at night. But Su Lin understood, standing at the water's edge in the cold gray light before sunrise, that Pacific Ridge had noticed their progress and intended, one way or another, to make certain the truth never reached a county courthouse before her 90 days expired. The county mining commissioner, a deliberate and unhurried man named Judge Elias Farrow, who traveled a circuit between 4 counties and had heard, in 30 years on the bench, every manner of claim dispute the Sierra could produce, convened the hearing on Copper Bend's contested assay on a bright December morning in the same courthouse building that housed the recorder's office. Its single room, crowded well past capacity, with camp residents drawn by curiosity, sympathy, or simple appetite for spectacle, in roughly equal measure. Su Lin stood before the commissioner's bench in a plain, dignified dress old Quan's daughter had helped her sew from careful savings, and spoke, when Judge Farrow invited her to present her case, in English that had grown steadily more confident across the 11 months since her arrival at Gold Run, no longer halting or fragmentary, but measured, deliberate, and entirely her own. She laid out the timeline plainly, Sackett's illness, his recovery, his gratitude, his death, and the will properly witnessed and notarized before any question of the claim's value had ever entered the discussion, establishing beyond any reasonable dispute that her ownership predated Corwin's assessment and could not, therefore, have been motivated by prior knowledge of the ground's worth. She then produced her own detailed notes on Corwin's assay visit, the exact figures she had read in his private ledger months before, figures she had spent months memorizing rather than writing down for fear of exactly this moment arriving too soon and being dismissed as fabrication after the fact. Corwin, seated near the front with a Pacific Ridge attorney at his elbow, watched her testimony with an expression of careful, practiced boredom that cracked only slightly when she described, in precise and unhurried detail, the annotation in his own hand, reading, "Vein continues, strong probability of depth." A phrase she recited from memory with such exact confidence that a low murmur ran through the crowded room. Judge Farrow, unmoved by murmurs but visibly interested in specifics, asked how a citizen could be expected to verify figures recalled from memory alone against a licensed assayer's sworn official report. And Sue Lin, without hesitation, nodded toward the courthouse door, where Caleb Winslow stood waiting with a leather satchel of documents that would answer the judge's question considerably more conclusively than her memory alone ever could. Caleb approached the bench and presented the Sacramento Survey Office's certified copy of Corwin's working notes, along with the county recorder's file showing 6 prior claims condemned by Corwin's assessments and subsequently acquired by Pacific Ridge Consolidated within 18 months of each condemnation. And Judge Farrow examined both documents in a silence that stretched long enough for the courtroom's earlier murmuring to die entirely away. Old Quan took the stand next, testifying in clear and unhesitating detail to Obadiah Sackett's sound mind and free will on the afternoon he'd dictated his final wishes to the traveling notary. His account corroborated by the notary's own preserved records, and closing when Judge Farrow asked whether he had anything further to add, with a quiet observation that struck the crowded room considerably harder than any figure or document had managed, that this camp had spent 11 months assuming Su Lin Ong needed a translator standing beside her at every turn, when in fact she had understood every word spoken about her, over her, and against her since the day she arrived, and had simply chosen, wisely as it turned out, not to correct the assumption until the moment it mattered most. Corwin's attorney attempted a defense built on the assayer's professional discretion in weighing ambiguous ore samples, but the argument collapsed entirely once Judge Farrow compared the certified Sacramento figures against the official Gold Run County filing and found the 2 documents, prepared by the same man within weeks of each other, describing fundamentally different ground. Corwin himself, given the opportunity to explain the discrepancy, offered nothing beyond a thin insistence that assay work involved reasonable margins of professional judgment, an explanation Judge Farrow dismissed with a single dry observation that professional judgment did not typically have a claim's stated value between 1 private notebook and 1 public filing produced in the same season. The judge ordered the Copper Bend claim's ownership confirmed to Su Lin Ong without further contest, referred Corwin's conduct to the state licensing board for formal review, and noted for the record his considerable interest in examining the 6 additional claims Su Lin's research had identified, a remark that visibly unsettled the Pacific Ridge attorney seated beside a suddenly very quiet Yarnell near the back of the room. As the courtroom began to empty into the cold December afternoon, Caleb crossed to where Su Lin stood, still absorbing the weight of a verdict she had worked 11 months to earn, and took her hand in front of the entire dispersing crowd, in full view of Mrs. Dill and Sheriff Teague, and every man who had once discussed her future over a stew pot, as though she couldn't understand a word of it, and said, plainly and for anyone still listening to hear, that he intended to court her properly now that the county had finally stopped getting in the way. Spring came to Widow Creek with the particular thoroughness of Sierra thaw, swelling the creek over its winter banks and softening the ground along Copper Bend's exposed quartz vein, enough that the follow-up assay Judge Farrow had personally ordered, conducted by an assayer from a neighboring county with no connection whatsoever to Pacific Ridge Consolidated, confirmed every figure Su Lin had carried in her memory since the autumn afternoon she'd first read Corwin's private ledger, and confirmed further that the vein's depth exceeded even Corwin's own optimistic private notation. Corwin himself did not remain at Gold Run to witness the confirmation. The state licensing board's review, informed considerably by the 6 additional claims Judge Farrow had flagged for investigation, revoked his commission within 2 months of the hearing, and Pacific Ridge consolidated, facing the prospect of a formal fraud inquiry reaching well beyond a single disputed claim. Quietly abandoned its interest in Widow Creek's water rights, rather than risk further exposure. Mrs. Dill extended Sulin's store credit again by early spring, with an apology delivered stiffly but sincerely. And the camp's collective memory, as camps so often managed, revised itself gradually to remember Sulin less as a suspicious foreign washerwoman who'd inherited suspiciously convenient property, and more as the sharp-eyed claim holder who'd caught the county assayer at his own game. A story several miners now told in the company store, with the particular pride of men who liked to imagine they'd suspected Corwin's dishonesty all along. Sulin found herself, in the months following the hearing, increasingly sought out by camp residents who had once refused to meet her eyes, several of them widows and small claim holders anxious about the accuracy of their own recorded assessments, and she began, at Old Quan's gentle encouragement, keeping informal books for anyone at Gold Run willing to pay a modest fee, teaching 2 of the camp's children to work simple sums on a borrowed frame modeled after her father's abacus, while their mothers watched with an interest that would have seemed unimaginable a year before. Caleb, for his part, spent that spring dividing his labor between his own Widow Creek claim and Copper Bend's expanding operation. The 2 claims increasingly worked as a single enterprise in every practical sense, long before any legal document formalized the arrangement, and the camp, watching them work the creek together each morning, gradually stopped commenting on the arrangement at all, which Sulin had learned by then to recognize as Gold Run's particular way of granting its fullest approval. On a warm afternoon in early June, Sulin stood at the edge of the Copper Bend claim, watching Caleb direct 2 newly hired hands along the widened sluice, her father's abacus resting in her apron pocket, where she now carried it daily rather than keeping it wrapped away for private comfort, its jade bead worn a little smoother each month by the thumb of a woman who had finally stopped needing to hide how carefully she counted. She had written to her silo the week before, her first letter home in over a year, that carried genuinely good news rather than careful reassurance, telling him that the claim their family's desperate contract had nearly cost her now produced enough, honestly and legally hers, to book his own passage across an ocean she had once crossed alone and afraid, and that Gold Run, whatever its faults, had finally proven itself a place where a person's worth could be weighed correctly if she was patient enough and stubborn enough to make the ledger balance in her own favor. She thought often, in these quieter months, of her father bent over his rice merchant's accounts, of her mother's herb pouch now nearly empty of its Toitian remedies, but replenished slowly with what she'd learned to gather along Widow Creek, and of the particular, hard-won satisfaction of watching a county courthouse finally read her the way she had always read everyone else, completely and without a single word lost in translation. Caleb found her there at the claim's edge as the light turned gold over the ridge, and asked, in the same plain, unhurried voice he'd used to ask her name outside the company store nearly a year before, whether she thought Copper Bend needed a proper sign posted at the trailhead now that its ownership stood beyond any county's dispute. And Sulin, turning the jade bead once more between her fingers, told him that a claim with her name legally recorded on it required no further announcement to anyone who mattered. If you had arrived in a country that assumed you couldn't read its language, its laws, or its lies, what is the first page you would have memorized to prove them wrong, and how long would you have waited before you let them find out you already knew? Tell me in the comments which moment of Sulin's story you'd have found hardest to survive, and subscribe if you want the next chapter of Gold Mountain Brides the moment it arrives.